question 2.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was just showing folks as an example of another thing the missionaries did. Father Juvenaly, who will be my theme for the next half hour or so, was one of the other monks. Everybody knows about Father Herman. I almost feel apologetic about talking about him so much because so much has been written about him, and he was canonized in 1970. So people learned about him, and he's venerated. His icon is practically in every church in the OCA for sure, and even in other churches in America, because he's the first, and he's the original monk and the rest. But I'm afraid he's glorified, at least in his liturgical expression, for secondary reasons. Yes, he was a holy monk, but during his life, there are no miracles. All the miracles attributed to Father Herman happened at his gravesite after he died, and the Aleutic people continued to make pilgrimage to his gravesite on the 100th anniversary of his repose, the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the missionaries in 1894. The local Aleut people built a chapel over his grave. And they continued to make pilgrimage to the island and to pray at his gravesite. And it's there that the miracles of healing began. During his life, he didn't heal anybody. So we glorify him as the wonder worker and the healer, but that's only posthumous. And nobody would be going to his grave and remembering him or building a church over his gravesite, except that they venerated him as their defender, the one who interceded for them. In 1818, when Alexander Baranov, the governor who was exploiting the people, was finally replaced, the new governor, Simeon Yanovsky, went straight to Monk's Lagoon and said to Father Herman, "What in God's name has been going on here the last 30 years?" You see, because the problem was, the monks were writing their complaints, blowing the whistle, but the governor was reading their letters, because their letters were going out on the company ships. And every time they made a complaint, he wrote to the board of directors back in St. Petersburg, accusing the monks of making all the trouble. And if you sat side by side in St. Petersburg and you were getting the complaints from the monks and the complaints from Baranov, they contradicted each other, sometimes paragraph by paragraph. So you could tell who was reading whose mail. The monks say at one point, "We don't have time or paper to report everything. If we had to tell you everything that's going on here in Kodiak, it would fill a book." Baranov, of course, trying to cover his tracks, writes, "These monks are causing me no end of trouble. If I had to tell you everything, it would fill a library." You could tell again who's reading whose mail. The hyperbole. So, 27 years of this. And finally Baranov is removed. And the new governor goes to the only survivor, the only eyewitness who has been there throughout this entire era, Father Herman. And so, but we know what Father Herman wrote. It's reported by the governor. He went to see Father Herman, the monk, in the forest at Monk's Lagoon, at Spruce Island. And Father Herman said, "Our people cry tears of blood. Help us to know what consolation is." And Yanovsky completely reversed the company policies, but he only lasted 2 years. He was so affected by Father Herman, he retired, resigned, and went back to Russia and became a monk himself. But we should be glorifying, in my opinion, we should be glorifying Father Herman for his heroic defense of the Alaskan Native peoples. There's one line in one of the Tropari: "Joyful North Star of the Church of Christ, guiding all to the heavenly kingdom, teacher and apostle of the true faith, intercessor and defender of the oppressed." Adornment of the Orthodox Church in America, Blessed Father Herman of Alaska. One line. In the Akathis, no mention of it. In the Lord I Call verses or Apostica or the canon of the feast, no mention. And even when we say intercessor and defender of the oppressed, there's nothing in the text that says who's oppressing whom. So this whole story that I told you is like off the radar screen. And I think this is simply because the person who wrote the original liturgical text for Father Herman was himself Russian, didn't really know the history very well, and only assumed that he was being canonized as a pious holy monk, like St. Anthony the Great. He went into the wilderness, he said his prayers, it was enemy-occupied territory, all of that. But there's much more to the story, and that's what I tried to bring to you this morning. And I think the missiological principle is you've got to stand in solidarity with the people to whom you are sent. To put it in another way, you can't save what you don't love. If you want to save America, the first thing you've got to do is love America. You can't stand outside the gates of America and denounce America for all its faults. That's not mission. And it won't work, by the way. But we have plenty of Orthodox who think that that's our job. And even the job of Christians, to constantly criticize and condemn. In every society, there are things that should be criticized and condemned. But we have to know what we stand for, and not only what we're against. And St. Herman, of course, was for the education of those people. He was for the government being kind and just, and he constantly appealed for that. And it finally happened. He lived to see the time when. Okay. So St. Herman is certainly worthy to be glorified as a saint. I'm just saying there was a lot more to his story than would meet the liturgical eye. But then, during that same time, so much controversy. The Tsar, Alexander I, became honorary chairman of the Russian-American Company. They finally got their monopoly because Catherine the Great died. And her son, Paul I, who was more than a little bit, he really was crazy. And was overthrown within a couple of years because he was clearly mentally ill and was in no position to run the empire. But during his time, when he first became emperor, they presented to him Shelikov's petition for the monopoly. Now, Paul and Catherine disagreed about everything. She loved everything French, he loved everything German. If she liked red, he liked blue. They were just opposite in every way. So when they presented Shelikov's petition again to Paul could say, as I imagine it, was my mother for this or against it? And as soon as they said she was completely against it, he signed the incorporation. 1798. Shelikov, by the way, was already dead under very suspicious circumstances. I'm sorry, we don't have to go into that murder mystery because that would be still something to be researched. But in any case, during this time when the conflicting reports are coming into the capital, Alexander I, who is now the Tsar of Russia and the honorary chairperson of the Russian-American Company Board of Directors, he's reading these conflicting letters. The monks are saying one thing, the company's saying something else. He sends his father confessor, someone he can really trust, Father Hiram Gideon, from the local monastery, St. Alexander Nevsky Monastery. He sends his own father confessor to Alaska to get to the bottom of this. And Hiram Gideon, unlike the monks who had come earlier, is a college graduate. I would like to know more about him. I mean, where he was educated and so forth. But he's an articulate, aristocratic, probably from an aristocratic background, an aristocratic but at least very well educated, college-educated man with some linguistic training. And we know this because when he got to Kodiak, one of the first things he did was learn the local Aleutic language, which as far as we know, none of the monks actually did. They had to deal with Pormishleniki who spoke both languages, who had intermarried into the tribe. They depended on those guys for their interpretation. Gideon not only learned the Aleutic language, but developed an alphabet for it and opened a school. At one point before he left Kodiak, over 100 children were learning to read and write in their own language with their own alphabet, and in Russian, of course, and they were singing the Lord's Prayer at the liturgy in the Kodiak church in Aleutic. So this Hiram monk took the time to learn the language, open a school, develop an alphabet, and begin translating liturgical books at least, and that's what the kids will learn to read from. The Lord's Prayer, the Creed, Holy God, Holy Mighty, in their own language. It's still being sung. But it was Father Gideon who introduced this. And then, of course, he had to go back to Russia to report directly to his boss, the emperor, on the conditions in Alaska. But we have the beginning of a school. 1804, 1805, the same time as the Shakers were building their settlement not too far from here at Pleasant Hill. That's when Father Gideon was in Kodiak, learning the Aleutic language of the people, devising an alphabet, and opening the first school in Alaska, where Alaska Native kids were learning to, well, most of them spoke Russian too, because of the intermarriage. Daddy spoke Russian with all his friends. Mommy spoke Aleut with all her friends. The Russians were still a small minority. And one footnote, the Russians, as we call them, were probably not, in fact, ethnic Russians. They were coming out of Siberia. Evidence is that at least a third of them were also native people from Siberia. So it was native people coming together with other native people. Another third of them were of mixed Russian, Siberian native background. And maybe only a third of them were ethnically Slavic from Europe. Europe's a long way from Alaska, 12 time zones. It's the opposite side of the world. So there weren't that many people from Europe who came all the way to Alaska. They were coming out of Siberia. And the people we call Russians were probably not blonde and blue-eyed. They were almost certainly, they looked like Alaska Native people. We know there was plenty of contact between them even before the Russians came, trade and commerce and such. So that's the story, the ending of the story of the mission. The Valhalla mission, you could say, was a failure because they spent most of their time either under house arrest, fighting the company, or one by one, two by two, they went. A delegation did go back to Russia to blow the whistle. The ship sank. So all attempts to change things in Kodiak failed. People just gave up and went home. Others drowned at sea. And one just disappeared. And here's the one I want to tell you about because it's a really interesting, I think, fascinating story. Father Juvenaly was a military officer. His wife died. So he's an officer in the Russian army. His wife died, and so in 1792, he resigned his commission and went to Valhalla to become a monk. And 2 years later, Gregory Shelikov showed up and tried to recruit everybody to come to Alaska. He volunteered. Now, there was only one priest going to Alaska. They figured they needed at least one more. He was literate. He was an officer in the Russian army. So they ordained him. Just before they left for their 8,000-mile walk, Juvenaly was ordained to be a priest. They figure he has plenty of time. They have monks walking across Siberia. He'll learn to serve properly. The other monk will teach him, right? And that's what happened. So Juvenaly, along with Father Yosef, the Hiram monk who was the head of the mission, walk all the way across Siberia, get on the ship, go to Kodiak. They encounter everything we've talked about. But the monks divvied the mission territory on the mainland among themselves. Father Makarios was going to go out to the Aleutian chain. They had sailed past it, but now he was going to go out there and evangelize the Unamna people, the Aleut people of the Aleutian Islands. He's the one I mentioned earlier. He was disappointed. Everybody was already baptized. There were already chapels in every village. He had a lot of weddings. And chrismations. And this was important too because as he recorded them in the metrical books, there was then finally a record of who was married to whom and who their children were. Because these men were being paid, and they had money, and they had pensions coming, like Social Security. And so it was important to know who are the heirs. If something happens to the employee of the Russian American company, you had to know who was his wife and who was. There was no record until the church came and registered all of this. So poor Father Makari was basically a census taker. He didn't have many people to baptize, but he had the weddings and the chrismations. Father Juvenaly was sent to the very middle of Alaska, the area around what is now Prince William Sound. It's where the Exxon Valdez tragically was sent to ground about 30 years ago. Prince William Sound is like the hollow part right in the very middle of Alaska, and there are lots of islands. It's a very beautiful place, and Father Juvenaly was sent there. They speak Aleut, the same language that Father Gideon had already was going to learn. He wasn't there yet. Well, they dropped him off there in Prince William Sound among the Kodiak, the Aleutic people, and he was never heard from again. 100 years went by and nobody knows what happened. And then, skipping ahead a bit, in 1874, 80 years after the mission arrived, a history of Alaska was published in California. University of California, Berkeley issued a history of Alaska in English, about twice as thick as this, hardbound. Hubert Howe Bancroft wrote this book. He was the preeminent American historian of his time. He had already written a history of the Americas, he'd written a history of Mexico, and now Hubert Bancroft writes a history of Alaska, except for a big problem. He spoke Spanish and could do research in the history of Mexico, Of course, he knew English and could do research in the history of the USA, but he never knew Russian. Now, in 1872, Alaska had been Russian for 127 years. It had been American for 5. How much of the history was written in English? None. How much of it was written in Russian? All of it. He didn't read or write or speak Russian. How did he write a 400-page book? And the answer is, he didn't bother to learn Russian. He depended on translators and people who had been to Alaska to bring him documents and translate these documents for him. Now, we know who the main translator was. His name was Ivan Petrov. I'm not sure that's his real name. It's certainly his pen name. It's the only name we have for him. He certainly knew Russian. He was certainly not Orthodox. And he didn't like Bancroft. And in fact, he considered himself abused and underpaid by Mr. Bancroft. So Mr. Petrov got even. He presented to Bancroft English translations of Russian documents. The original Russian documents, in fact, however, never existed. So we have entire chapters of the history of Alaska in the original Bancroft history that are purely the product of Mr. Petrov's rather fertile imagination, including the disappearance of Father Juvenaly. Now, in the Russian period, people were constantly asking, has anyone heard anything? When explorers, when Przemysleniki went to the mainland, they were constantly asking, what happened to this monk? He just disappeared 20, 30 years ago. No answer. But Mr. Bancroft has his dying words, because Petrov presented him with the diary of Father Juvenaly. Now, there's a problem with this. I didn't consider this when I first came to Alaska. I just believe what the history book said. The diary says, Father Juvenaly continued west from Prince William Sound. He crossed Cook Inlet, where modern-day Anchorage stands, and went as far as Iliamna Lake on the western side. And there he was killed by the Indians. That's what the diary says. The diary says Father Juvenaly continued west, and when he got to this lake, the local Indian chief offered to him his daughter as a bride. If you remember the old Jeremiah Johnson movie, you know that Robert Redford had the same problem. They said to him, the chief wants you to marry his daughter, he wants to form a permanent alliance. Jeremiah Johnson / Robert Redford was not interested and tried to refuse. His buddy, who spoke the local language, says, you've got to marry her or they're going to kill both of us. So he's kind of forced into this marriage. He has an Indian wife he's clearly not interested in. Only gradually does he actually come to love her. But that's the rest of the Jeremiah Johnson movie. In this case, it's the same scenario. The monk comes to this big lake, the size of Connecticut. The Indian chief offers him his daughter. He refuses. And then he wakes up that night and the woman is in his bed. And one thing leads to another. And he gets up the next morning to confess what happened the night before, how he'd been seduced by the Indian woman. And he's already refused to marry her. And so they come and kill him because of this. That he had refused to marry the Indian. Well, if that's really the truth about Father Juvenaly, he's not a holy martyr for the faith. He's a fallen monk who was seduced by an Indian woman and was killed because he refused to marry her. It's a huge cross-cultural miscommunication here, but it doesn't make him a martyr. And that's where it stood. This is the chapter. This is in our history books. In the rewrite of the Bancroft history, 100 years later, there's a whole chapter called The Sin of Father Juvenaly. It's a great 19th century soap opera kind of theme, and pretty much everybody believes it. So did I. It's in all the history books. And then, 20 years ago, maybe 25, an elder, a Yupik elder, an Eskimo elder, came to see me. He said, I want to tell you the story of the first priest to come into our region. Now, the first priest that went there is Father Jacob Netsvetov. He was there for almost 20 years, and he's canonized as a saint. So I think I'm going to learn something new about Father Jacob. That wasn't the story. He says, according to the way I heard it as a boy in 1920, the first priest to come into our area came along the Bering Sea coast, Aniak Jogami. Aniak is boat, like a canoe, not a kayak. There's a word for kayak. It's kayak. It's a Yupik word that's used in English. But amniach is their word for an open boat. So I'm assuming it's small because there's only 1 or 2 people in it, like a canoe. Amniach Jochimi. And as they arrived, Amniach Jochimi, in this little boat, they encountered on the beach ahead of them a shaman with hunters, a hunting party among whom was a shaman. And the shaman, seeing the priest approaching, became alarmed. And he said to the hunters, chase him away, get him out of here. I don't know what the hunters did. Maybe they shook their fists. Maybe they raised their spears or pointed their arrows at him. They kept coming. The shaman gave the order, kill. And as they shot their arrows, the priest fell into the boat. And his guide or helper, remember this area was not mapped, his guide or helper jumped overboard and tried to swim across the river. The river's very wide, it's the mouth of the river. And the Yupik hunters on the shore were astounded. They have no tradition of swimming. And you would understand if you ever tried to swim in the Kuskokwim River. It's barely above freezing. It's always cold, and hypothermia will kill you before you drown. So there's no custom of swimming there. They were amazed that this guy could swim. They never saw anyone do this. And they said he swam like a seal. He came up for air, took a gulp of oxygen, and kept swimming. The only way they could catch him was to get into their kayaks and chase him down. They eventually did. But they were amazed at his ability to swim. Then they came back to the amniach, the canoe. They pulled that ashore, and the shaman removed from the priest's dead body his pectoral cross and put it on himself. And then this shaman tried to do some kind of seance or magic, some kind of ceremony, but he felt himself levitated, lifted up, and this startled him. He calmed down and tried again, and a third time, each time with the same result, feeling lifted. This scared him enough that he took the cross off. He tossed it aside to someone in the group and said, I don't know what this is, but there's some power here I can't deal with. And if anyone else ever comes with one of these, we better listen. That was the end of the story. And I dismissed it because it's an old wives' tale. No priest ever came here who was killed. And someone said, well, maybe that was Father Juvenaly. Or wasn't he killed at Aleut on the lake, 100 miles further east? And wasn't he... Well, the only way to find out was to find out Bancroft's sources. So I went to the University of Alaska, Berkeley, to the Bancroft Library, it's named after this guy, and asked for the resources for this diary. They gave me the English translation of the Russian diary. And on the front of it says, this is an authentic translation of the original diary that was discovered in the Aleutian Islands, and Mr. Petrov made this very accurate English translation. Well, it's suspicious that the Russian original has never, ever appeared. And then on the front cover it still says, in Petrov's handwriting, the original is in the possession of Father Innocent Innocenty Shishnikov. Well, there was never a priest with that name in the Aleutian Islands. I already know this. I opened the diary, and from the first page I could tell it was a fraud. Something very simple for an Orthodox priest to do. And I'll tell you why. On the first page, Father Juvenaly says, on such and such a date, I left Kodiak aboard the ship, the St. Adrian and Anastasia. See, Father, you get it right away, don't you? There couldn't be such a ship, could there?
Yes, there is no such a feast.
There's no such feast.
Yes.
But if you're Orthodox, you know, there's an Adrian and Natalia. Petrov knew enough about Russia. He knew Adrian and somebody, but he got it wrong. There's all the ships that I mentioned, the Peter, the Pavel, the St. Michael the Archangel, the Simeon and Anna, the three hierarchs. We know those are real names because there are such saints and there are such feasts. But there is no Adrian and Anastasia. So already I'm smelling something suspicious. Continue. As a good monk, he not only wrote the date, but the feast day, the saint of that day. The saints' days are all wrong. He has saints I never heard of. And he has saints that do exist on the wrong day and even in the wrong month. You know, Peter and Paul in October. A 10-year-old Orthodox boy would say, the feast of Peter and Paul is in the summer, it's not in October. It would be like an American kid opening a diary and saying, Independence Day, October 31st, right? Halloween, July 4th. You don't have to be a genius or an expert in that culture to know this person does not know American society. It's the same thing with Juvenaly's diary. It's so clearly a fraud, but see, no American expert ever examined it from an Orthodox point of view, so they accepted it as legitimate. Okay, so I don't even have to read the third page. By the second page, I'm convinced it's a fraud, it's a forgery, and it's in Petrov's handwriting, so we know pretty much who made all this up. Okay, so back to square one. What really happened to Father Juvenaly? And the only lead we have is the elder's older story, the story that he heard almost 100 years ago now. Well, how can we prove that? Well, I'm not focused on this. It's not like a passion of my life to find out what happened to Father Juvenaly, but I'm dealing with Alaskan manuscripts for the last almost 50 years. Time and again, I find in the diary of a priest who's coming through the village of Queenahawk, where, according to the Yupik tradition, is where Father Juvenaly died. The priest mentions in 1850 or 60, I'm coming to the village of Queenahawk, where Father Juvenaly died. The next priest, Father Ilarion, comes in the 1870s. I'm coming to the village of Juvenaly, where Father Juvenaly died. I go back to Father Netsvetov's reports in the 1840s, and he says the same thing. I'm coming to the village of Juvenaly, where Father Juvenaly died. They don't give any details, but the beginning, you start realizing what the elders said was somehow already known by the Orthodox priests who later on visited this village. They're corroborating, not contradicting. Okay. So 3 priests from the 1800s pass through this village, and they all say exactly what the elders said. It was the village of Queenahawk, and that's where Father Juvenaly was martyred. And one of them even says, an old woman showed me the place where it happened. Literally the killing ground in Russian. Okay. But it's already considered a long time ago, in the 1880s and 1890s. Okay. Then, something else happens. A friend of mine who was researching Yupik history, which only goes back to the 1850s, is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I'm from Allentown. Bethlehem and Allentown are practically the same city. They've grown together and merged 100 years ago. And my friend from Alaska is researching the life of John Kilbuck, who was the first Moravian Christian missionary to this very village. And Kilbuck is writing reports from Alaska back to Bethlehem, and this report survives in the archives of the Moravian Brethren in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And my friend comes across this, and she doesn't even know that I'm interested in this, but she comes across this because she's suspicious. This is what Kilbuck writes in his journal, 1890, 100 years after Father Juvenaly disappeared. Apparently, Kilbuck says, I'm not the first missionary to come to this village. The people here tell me that a long time ago, it's been 100 years, so that's about right. The people here tell me that a long time ago, a Russian priest came along the coast in a little canoe. And they encountered a hunting party, among whom was a shaman. Does this sound familiar? And the shaman tried to chase him away, but he kept coming. So he was killed in a hail of arrows. And his guide, his helper, jumped overboard and tried to escape, swimming like a seal. It's word for word what I heard in 1990, that Kilbuck heard in 1890, about an event that happened in 1790. And the same story. They had to chase him down. The shaman removed the cross. The same story was recorded 100 years before I heard it, but it's word for word the same story. Now that sort of corroborates it, doesn't it? Either they made up the same story and they've been telling the same lies for 100 years, or it really is true. It's much more logical that it really is true. Because remember the attitude toward oral language. You're careful what you say. You can't retract it. It lasts forever. And when I asked the elder, when I told him, I don't know, the story doesn't make sense to me. He didn't retract anything. All he said, I just told you exactly the story as I heard it. Faithful to the oral tradition. I think this is important for Christian theology, but we can come back to that later. Anyway, okay, so it seems like what the old man said, that story's been around for a long time, and it's exactly the same story. How can we prove it? There's still open questions. First of all, why were they afraid of him? He was unarmed. He's in a canoe with one other guy. They were the ones on the beach with all the weapons. Why were they so afraid of him? This doesn't make sense to me. And then I went to the Smithsonian Institute to look at their Yupik, not their exhibit. There's not a whole lot of Alaskan stuff on exhibit. You know, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Institute, the Museum of the American Indian is one man's collection. It's not everything that they've ever collected, ever. Most of the collection, 98%, is in storage. And it's amazing, the storage bins are higher than the ceiling. And the drawers are about 6 inches high. So you have drawers from the floor to the ceiling, 30 feet. And the building is at least 2 football fields long, 200 yards long. And each of these drawers has archaeological or anthropological collection of the Smithsonian Institute. 2% is in the galleries. When you walk through, that's 2%. 98% is in these huge storage bins. And by the way, any American citizen who asks, you don't have to be a professor from a university, anyone who asks can get permission to dig through the national attic, which is what it feels like. So I went there to see their Eskimo, their Yupik stuff. I opened this drawer, and it's filled with something I never saw before. Chains, links, chains, made of ivory. And the explanation from the anthropologist was, shamans in Alaska, hundreds of years ago, began carving ivory chains in imitation of Siberian shamans who wore metal chains. So when they saw Father Juvenaly approach, wearing a metal chain, it's perfectly reasonable to believe they believed him to be a shaman from the opposite side, from the Asian side of the Bering Sea. How do you protect yourself from the power, from the magic of a shaman who may have some reason to harm you? Option 1, keep them far enough away. Option 2, when they get too close, kill them. So Father Juvenaly, it seems, was killed as an alien intruding shaman, wearing, and the rest of the evidence there is that when they killed him, the shaman wanted that chain. You see, it all fits together. Finding those ivory chains in Washington, D.C., that explains that part of the mystery. They were afraid of him because he was an alien shaman from the other side. He had magical power. They couldn't defend themselves. Okay, but what about his guide, his reader, his assistant? The guy who could swim. Who was he? He left Kodiak alone. Well, remember, none of the area was mapped, but the local Indian tribes knew the way through the mountains, knew where the rivers were. He wanted to go to the Bering Sea coast. This Indian guide, showed him the way in his canoe. The Indians have birch bark canoes. The kayaks are on the coast that go into the ocean, but in the interior, people have canoes, angyacho, little boat. So I'm retracing Father Juvenaly's path from Prince William Sound in the middle of Alaska to the Bering Sea coast in the west. And I'm in the small Indian village, Tyonik. They're all Orthodox there too. St. Juvenaly converted them 200 years ago, and they're still all Orthodox. The only church in town is St. Nicholas Orthodox Church. And I'm sitting with the starosta, who has the name's Maxime, for Maxime the Confessor. Maxime, does anybody in this village swim? He says, swim? Why do you ask? I said, well, I'm working on this story of Father Juvenaly, and this is one thing that doesn't fit. He got to the Bering Sea coast, but his helper could swim, and swim very well. He said, we all swim in this village. We're beluga whale hunters. We harpoon the whale. If it dives, we teach our kids to swim and dive in after it. It's the only village in Alaska like this. So I think we can safely now detect that Father Juvenaly needed a guide to show him the way west. And he picked up a convert, one of the people he had baptized, to show him the way with his canoe. And there's more evidence. If that guide could have spoken Yupik, he could have said to the guys chasing him, hey cousins, don't shoot, I'm one of your relatives. But he couldn't say that because he wasn't one of their relatives. He was from the neighboring tribe. And they came in his boat. So we have two martyrs, not just Father Juvenaly, but Father Juvenaly and his guide, Father Juvenaly and his companion, Father Juvenaly and who was with him, whoever he was. Because we have Peter the Aleut, people who have painted his icon have been calling him Paul. Of course, we have no evidence that his name was Paul, but he was certainly an Orthodox Christian. He certainly was one trying to help the priest continue his missionary journeys to the West, and he died trying to bring the gospel to the Yupik people in the 1790s. We'll probably never know his name. But Father Juvenaly was killed, therefore, not because he was seduced by the Indian girl at all. But you see, that's in all the books. So when I teach Alaska history, especially when it's students all over the state and they're doing it by internet, by distance delivery, I send them the Bancroft history, the Bancroft story. And then I send them this, what I just told you, as a lecture. So they're getting the information in two ways. Written down, like I got it a long time ago, from Bancroft, and spoken from a recording I made of this talk. And then their assignment is read the text in Xerox form, listen to the lecture, and answer these questions. Every time I do this, I get the answers from the book. These are college seniors who by now have been programmed to believe if it's in the book, it must be true. But the assignment is, and listen to the lecture. The first go around, there's no evidence that they listen to the lecture. So I write F, redo. And they call me up. I answered the questions as they're in the book. I said, but remember, that wasn't your assignment. Your assignment was read the text and listen to the lecture. So they swear that they've listened to the lecture the second go around. But they'll still say, but the book says. I think this is the brain damage that literacy does. We have to believe it because it's in print. And by the way, these are Alaska Native people who should be believing spoken word, but they're so programmed after 16 years of schooling that what's in the book has to be true. I say, do it again. D-, do it again. Finally, the third round, they've finally taken what I said on the lecture. Get a clue, I'm grading their papers. Right? But you see how programmed we are to think that if it's print, it must be true, and if it's spoken, it's hearsay. It's not admissible in court. It doesn't count as much. But in fact, it's the oral tradition that told the truth, and the written that was in error. So when I finally get them to it, usually the third go-around, they finally say, well, now that we're giving both of them kind of equal weight, we can't tell what happened. That's what I want. I want them to say, what you heard is one thing, what you read is something else, and giving both of them equal credibility, it's an open question. Right, now we're ready to do history. Just because it's written down doesn't necessarily make it the entire truth. There's almost always more to the story than that. And just because it's what elders, especially Alaska Native elders, say, doesn't mean you should just dismiss it as irrelevant or unimportant. I did. I'm trying to help them avoid the same mistake I made. Now, this is the significance of this. Well, there's two, but I want to point out one. I realized that for 200 years, people in that village have been telling the same story, word for word, exactly the way they heard it. This is not what we think of oral tradition. We think it gets garbled with age. That really doesn't happen. Think of the time of the apostles. The apostles, the 12 apostles, went out into all the world. And some people, you can understand this in the modern way, some people accompanied them. They were groupies. They went from town to town with the apostle. They heard the same stump speech 20 times, 30 times. They heard the gospel according to Matthew. They heard the gospel according to Mark. Because they didn't change it every time they went to the next village, and they didn't add anything or subtract anything. They told the gospel story the same way every time they went, over and over again. People memorized it. People learned to tell the story, word for word, the way it was. Which came first? This is a wonderful thing for Orthodox to ask. What came first, the church or the New Testament? Church. The church starts on Pentecost. The preaching of the gospel starts at Pentecost. It was decades before any of it was written down. And it was centuries before any of it was gathered and canonized by the church. The church existed for hundreds of years without the written New Testament. The epistles of St. Paul come first, and the Gospels come even later than that. How did the church know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were authentic Gospels, and the Gospel of Thomas and Philip and Wright were fake? Because when they picked up those texts, they said, funny, we never heard these stories before. Right? It wasn't some authority in the Vatican who decided not to include the Gnostic Gospels into the Bible. It was the whole church community. And it's like me in the diary of St. Juvenaly. You read this and you say, this is clearly not true. A couple of details and you know immediately. It's not the way we heard it. It's not the story as we've always repeated it. It's not what Grandpa said. The oral tradition came first, and it was very reliable. And here's the evidence of this, if you want to refer to anything in the modern world. If you've ever been in a play, like my daughter did how many Shakespearean plays in her life, so she was Lady Macbeth, for example. Well, if you've ever been in a play yourself, you know at the first rehearsal, you're kind of shaky even with your own lines. And someone's there to prompt you if you forget. But by the time you get to dress rehearsal, you don't know just your part. You know everybody's part.
Yes.
Right? So the human mind, the human brain has the capability of memorizing verbatim entire texts. And if you make a mistake in your lines, there's 20 people in the audience who know the play well enough to know that you stumbled. And somebody else on the stage with you, if you suddenly space out, will whisper your line to you because they know what it was. When I mentioned this to Professor Kesich, my professor of New Testament at St. Vlad's, I said, we in your New Testament class, we studied the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because people noticed centuries ago, if you put Matthew, Mark, and Luke together on the same page, on the same table, entire texts are pretty much identical. They say the same thing, word for word. Luke and Matthew have the Beatitudes. Luke has only a few, Matthew has more, but the ones that are the same are word for word the same. Now, German theologians 100 years ago said, well, the reason for that is there was an earlier gospel text from which Matthew, Mark, and Luke copied. And that earlier Quelle, source is the word in German. Quelle is the word for source. The Q document is the document from which all three of the evangelists copied. The Q has been lost. The source document has been lost, but it's clear the three of them copied from it. That explains why they have exactly the same words. I said to Professor Kesich after my experience in Alaska, I don't think the Q was written. I think the Q, the source, was the oral tradition that the church knew and could recite verbatim. And he said, that's my theory too. I should have said, why didn't you teach us that in seminary? Because he was referring to the German. He said, but I'm from Serbia. In Serbia, when I was a boy, the elders could recite the ancient sagas of the Serbian people that went on for hours. Just like someone who can recite all of Romeo and Juliet, or all of Othello, or all of Shakespeare, because when there is no writing, it's your duty and responsibility to memorize it authentically and pass it on to the next generation. And I'm sure that that's how the New Testament was ultimately written down. There wasn't an angel whispering into St. Matthew's ear, dictating, and he was thinking. It didn't happen that way. The gospel was public knowledge. It was publicly preached. It was publicly preached for decades. People heard the same story, not once, not twice, but daily, village by village, town by town. For decades, they had memorized. And it's just like you ever read a child a story, a 4-year-old kid, you read them a bedtime story, and they like it, so they want you to read it again. But you're tired, so you're trying to skip something. Right? They call you on it, tell it the right way. Well, I'm sure that that's exactly what would have happened if an evangelist had written down the gospel in some way according to his own taste, or left something out according to his own forgetfulness. The whole community would have said, you left that part out. You see what I'm saying? This is how the Scripture itself was. And I think in the modern world, we're so, like my students, focused on the printed word, and what's written has to be the ultimate truth, and the oral tradition can be disregarded. But in fact, in real life, it's the other way around. And the way the New Testament was written is the other way around. And I have personal experience of that, dealing with the death of Father Juvenaly, who now we can safely, I think, say, with all the corroborating evidence, he died at the village of Guinahawk on the shores of the Bering Sea with his companion, who was almost certainly a Native American from the Dena'ina Indian tribe. So it's not just Father Juvenaly. Now, in our text, in our liturgical texts, watch out for the books. In our liturgical text, they commemorate him as Saint Juvenaly of Iliamna. Iliamna is the place the diary said he died, and it's clearly not true. And if he died at Iliamna, he ain't no saint. You see the problem here? But it's already in the books. So getting people to reconsider what's in the books as not quite accurate, once it's in print, we're fighting an uphill battle to get people to reconsider.
It's like the tradition of the Thanksgiving that tells always Father Pedro, actually this is not just now.
Yeah, and you're stuck with it. Once it's in the book, it's really an uphill battle to get people to reconsider once it's in print. But I'm saying this for that very reason, that Father Juvenaly is now one last thing. I have a nephew who married a woman. May she rest in peace. She's already fallen asleep. But he married a woman from Guinahawk, and as he moved to her village, I said to him, Michael, keep your ears open, just in case some elder, for whatever reason, decides to tell the story, they don't even know his name, of that monk who was killed and so forth. We can tell them, we can fill in that who it was, it's probably Juvenaly. But listen in case someone, well, his ears. And finally he came to me and said, I heard an elder tell that story. Was it the same? Yeah, the same way, except for one thing. The way the elder I heard tell the story, when the monk was standing in the front of the Aleut, in front of the canoe, he was facing the people, the hunters and the shaman on the beach. And of course the archers are already there with the arrows and the bowstrings drawn. They're ready to release the arrows and kill the guy, right? He can see them. They're not much further away than that pew over there, right? To shoot an arrow, you've got to be within sight of the person, and the person can see that you're shooting the arrow at them. So as he was about to die, quite clearly, it looked to the hunters and the shaman on the beach that this priest was chasing away flies. Now, Orthodox people understand this immediately. When I say this to any secular audience, they look at me like, huh? But you know and I know what he was doing. No, it's one of two things. He was either praying or blessing them, and I suspect it was blessing them. And he was doing it quickly. And so if you're doing this, now the people 200 years later still remember him as chasing away flies. Is that something they made up later on? Or is that an authentic eyewitness account of what it looked like to them? 200 years later, that's the way they're still telling that story of Father Juvenaly's martyrdom on the shores of the Bering Sea. Amazing, huh? So I have no doubt. People ask me about Peter the Aleut. Did it really happen? Yes, it really happened. Why do I believe so? First of all, Kodiak Aleutics were taken by the dozen, if not the 100. Ivan Petrov, Alexander Baranov's henchman, foreman, to Fort Ross, California. They weren't coming all the way from Alaska. The Russian-American company had an agricultural station and a fort in Bodega Bay, just north of San Francisco. Hundreds of Kodiak Aleutic people were taken there, rounded up. You're coming with me. We know the guy's name, Ivan Kuskov. The Kuskov house is the biggest house inside the fort. Ivan Kuskov was the guy who rounded up people and brought them to California. I didn't know anything about Ivan Kuskov until I'm living on Kodiak Island, visiting an elderly woman. This is 40 years ago. She was already 90. So she was born when? 1880. I'm interviewing this lady born in the 1880s. When I met her, she was 80 years old. But it's the 1960s, 1970s. Anyway, we're sitting in her house, and she's telling me about her grandfather who knew St. Herman. Perfectly believable, right? Her grandfather was born in 1800, right? So Father Herman died in 1837. Her grandfather, as a little boy, used to visit Father Herman, sat on his bed. So she's telling me her stories of what her grandfather told her about Father Herman. And her grandchildren, 4 or 5 of them, come stampeding through the house. She says to the kids, "It's a sunny day, boys and girls, go outside and play." But you know how kids are. On a sunny day, they want to be in, and on a rainy day, they want to go out. So the kids go out, but in 5 minutes, they're back. Catherine says to the kids, "Kids, I'm trying to tell these stories to Father Michael. Please go outside and play." Well, they're gone for about 5 minutes. And then the next thing, they're back in. Finally, Catherine Chichinoff loses her temper, as much as her grandmother did. She turned to these stampeding grandchildren and said, "Kuskov will get you if you don't behave." And at this point, I had no idea who Kuskov is. I had to ask, "Who's Kuskov? Don't you know who Kuskov is?" Kuskov used to come around to the villages with one of those bazookas mounted on his boat and say, "You're coming with me." And of course, they had no choice. They came. But if Kuskov got you, he put you on a ship, you wound up in California, and you never came home. So here we are, 200 years later. Kuskov is still the Aleut boogeyman. Again, it's all authentic. These people know they lived through this history. It's their story, and they've kept it alive, but only orally. So Kuskov will get you. So Kuskov got Peter the Aleut. He took him to California. They sent hunting parties down the coast, to San Diego and further, even to Baja California, hunting for sea otters. That's what they were there for. But the Spanish considered them trespassing on Spanish territory, aliens, sort of coming in the other direction, from us to Mexico. And what did they do with these people when they caught them? They arrested them. They put them in jail. Time and again, Kuskov had to pay ransom to get these arrested Aleuts back. I have no doubt that they used to beat up their own Indians. Why would they? Now, the biggest problem with the Peter the Aleut stories, there's 2 letters that were sent to Father Herman about the death of Peter the Aleut. One of them referred to him in his Aleutic name, Jomagana, which is an Aleutic name. It's not Yunnan. We know what tribe it is because of this. He's from Kodiak. And the other refers to him as Peter. Actually, it's not so much a letter, but an account about Father Herman getting the letter. He says, after he reads this account, "What was the name of this Aleut man who was killed?" And they tell him Peter. And Father Herman stands before the icon of Christ and says, "Holy new martyr Peter, pray to God for us." Now, why would they make that up? Why would someone report a martyrdom that never happened to Father Herman? It doesn't make sense. The name is an authentic Aleutic name, and we know the Spanish regularly arrested intruding alien Aleuts who were coming out of Alaska to Fort Ross and going down the coast. When they caught them, they arrested them, put them in jail. Okay. The problem is that the account that we have refers to the people who did this as Jesuits, when, of course, there were no Jesuits in California. Where were the Jesuits in the 1790s?
Expelled.
In Russia. They were all in Russia. The Pope had disbanded the Jesuit order, and Catherine the Great invited them to come to Russia and teach. So if you knew a Catholic in Russia, especially a Catholic priest, they all became Jesuits. It was the generic name for a Catholic. You see, this is where the confusion is. The report says the Jesuits did it. In Russia at that time, all Catholics were Jesuits and all Jesuits were sort of Catholics. You see the problem? That's where it gets confused. So people have disputed, well, there were no Jesuits in California, so it couldn't have happened. No, they were Franciscans, but I don't think the Franciscans beat it. They're using the term Jesuit to mean Roman Catholic. It's synonymous in the Russian vocabulary of that time, right? And they were certainly not clergy. It was the soldiers, when Christ was arrested, brought him into the barracks and put the crown of thorn on his head, made fun of him, whipped him, beat him. The passion of the Christ. It's the soldiers who do it. It's not the clergy. The people who yelled, crucify him, didn't physically crucify him. The soldiers did. I think it's the same for Peter the Aleut. They brought him into the barracks, they beat him up. He insisted that he was a Christian, and they said, no, you're not. And the evidence was, I'm sure when he was swearing that he was a Christian and refused to be baptized by them, he was saying, I'm a Christian. And what would an Orthodox person do to prove that they're a Christian when you don't even speak the same language? What physical sign can you make to prove that you're Christian? You would make the sign of the cross in the Orthodox way, right? I'm a Christian, I swear it. But they said, you're lying because you're doing it wrong. I mean, just think this through. What did the Spanish soldiers believe when he did the cross backwards from their tradition, right? You're not a Christian, you're lying. And they tortured him, and he died. I'm sure they weren't trying to kill him, but if they killed their own Indians and mistreated them, why would we doubt that they would kill one of ours? I mean, the story, I believe, is absolutely authentic. We have the Aleut martyr Peter the Aleut, whose icon is in St. Andrew's Church, right? I don't think it should be whitewashed and taken out. I'm saying, no, it's authentic Peter the Aleut. But even before him, a decade or longer before him, there was Father Juvenaly and his Denina Indian martyr, whose name we don't know. And we commissioned an icon of him, of the two of them. Father Juvenaly, who's in a monastic klobuk and cassock, holding a cross, and his companion, who is dressed in moose skin with porcupine quill decoration in Indian garb. And we can only call him and his guide, or his companion. The iconographers are the ones who said, since we already did Peter the Aleut, we called this guy Paul. So it would be Peter and Paul. But of course we don't really know his name. The important thing about all of this, finally, is that what the early monks did, and what I find really extraordinary, is they were prayerful and peaceful men, but they were extraordinarily courageous. They walked 8,000 miles. Right? They risked their lives. St. Herman was under arrest. They tried to kill him. He moved to Spruce Island to get out of harm's way. All of that. Juvenaly persevered. He saw those archers with the bowstrings drawn and the arrows pointed at him. And what did he do? He blessed them. That's the heritage on which we stand. We shouldn't be fearful. We'll try to speak about our faith and someone might ridicule or make fun of us. So, right? These people died. And therefore we have to honor them, but if we kiss their icons and we venerate their memory, then it behooves us also to behave as they did. And to be a little bit more faithful, a little bit more courageous, a little bit more, bold in our proclamation of our faith. And that's really what Great Lent is about, to prepare us for the joy and the overwhelming glory and beauty of Pascha, so that we too can have that energy and that courage to speak up, and at least when someone asks us, to testify to witness to our faith. So then we still have time. We are out of time. I'll introduce my next theme now, and we'll break for lunch. The next theme, the mission is gone. The monks are dead. St. Herman has died. The Aleuts build a chapel over Father Herman's grave on the 100th anniversary of his arrival. They don't forget. In 1894, they're building a chapel at their own expense, at their own initiative, over the cave in which Father Herman is buried. Because when he went to Spruce Island, he dug a cave too. And he lived in that cave the first year. You see how traditional this is? Like St. Anthony the Great, like St. Anthony of Kiev. And when he died, he gave orders, bury me in that cave. And they didn't want to. They wanted to take him to Kodiak and put him in a regular cemetery and have the priest perform a funeral. I'm told that they began to carry his coffin down the path toward the beach to take him to Kodiak against his wishes. And at one spot, the coffin suddenly became so heavy they had to put it down. And no number of men could pick it up. It suddenly weighed thousands of pounds. It couldn't be budged. And then when they tried to take it back where he wanted to be buried, in his cave, no problem. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. And they have a little chapel at that very spot and a cross that marks the place. This is as far as we got when we tried to bury him elsewhere. We had no choice but to take him back and bury him in his cave. At the canonization of St. Herman in 1970, this chapel is only about as big as this area where you're sitting again. It's not a very big chapel. It completely covers his gravesite. And they left a door under so you could crawl under the church and pray directly at what was the cave, the burial site of St. Herman. People developed years ago, the Aleutic people did years ago, taking some of the earth from that gravesite that had covered his coffin, and taking it home and using it to anoint each other. They mixed it with holy water and put like a mud cross on someone who was sick, and time and again they were healed. This is the beginning of the miracles of St. Herman, posthumously. No healings during his life, but the dirt that covered his bones has healing power. That's the power of holiness. It's like radiation. I think in the modern world we can even understand this better. In the ancient world it was harder to conceptualize. But we know radiation cures cancer, but too much of it gives you cancer. You have to be careful exactly what dosage you give. It's the same with holiness. Holiness radiates healing power, but too much of it is dangerous. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. You notice something, I will end with this, but I noticed something during the bishop's liturgy. When we're in the altar, the priests, however many there are, receive Holy Communion from the bishop's hands. So he doesn't just handle the communion that he himself communes, he has to handle all the holy consecrated bread and give it to each of the priests. The church considers this an overdose. So the bishop washes his hands before communion, but he also washes his hands after. Because, you see, it's a kind of, doesn't seem like a proper word. It's a kind of, an overdose of holiness. You need to be purified from it. Just like if you went into something that was radioactive and the Geiger counter detected that you had been contaminated with so much radiation, you have to cleanse yourself from that. It's not because it's evil in itself, but it's dangerous. Same with God. And this applies to women after childbirth. If you just read the 40-day prayers for a woman after childbirth, it sounds like giving birth defiled her or made her impure somehow. It's just the opposite. She has become too holy. And therefore she needs to be purified, not because giving birth defiled her, but because it's too much. Before she goes back to her regular daily life, she needs to be purified. The same way the bishop needs to wash his hands after distributing communion 50 times. You had an overdose. You've got to wash it off. Holiness is very powerful. And it's a physical presence. The dirt that covered Father Herman healed people of pneumonia and cancer. It radiates, but you have to be careful. And when you know you've had an overexposure to it, as the bishop does after communion, and as every woman who has given birth, they need to come to the church and be purified. Not because they did anything wrong, but just the opposite, because they've done something so sacred. Let's pray forward.
He said, look at the disciple of